In 1919, Alcock and Brown made their famous 3,000-kilometer crossing of the North Atlantic Ocean. The feat required fitting extra fuel tanks to their Vickers Vimy biplane, nearly doubling its usual range. Such long-distance flights got people thinking, was there a way an aircraft could take on fuel without having to land? Just a few years later, the first in-flight or air-to-air refueling experiments were carried out in America. The 1920s saw some great leaps forward in aviation. In America, the center of innovation was the U.S. Army Air Corps' Research and Development Unit at Dayton, Ohio, home of the Wright brothers. In 1922, Chief Test Pilot John McCready set a world endurance record of more than 35 hours in a Fokker T-2 while circling over San Diego, California. But the U.S. Army Air Corps wanted still greater endurance. The following year at San Diego's Rockwell Field, the world's first in-flight refueling system transferred fuel by hose between two US-built Airco DH-4B biplane bombers. That success was followed by a record 37-hour flight requiring 16 in-flight refuelings. A non-stop north-to-south flight across the USA with 3 in-flight refuelings followed. Those accomplishments preceded the first round-the-world flight in 1924, using 4 Douglas World Cruiser biplanes, but in-flight refueling and the associated logistics were not sufficiently developed, so caches of fuel were stationed along the route. Then, in 1929, an Atlantic Fokker C-2 named Question Mark, similar to Charles Kingsford Smith's Southern Cross, made a record endurance flight of more than 6 days over Los Angeles. Commanded by Major Carl Spaatz, it was refueled by a pair of Douglas C-1 biplane tankers taking turns, lowering their hoses through an aperture in the Fokker's roof. The following year, the Hunter brothers spent no less than 23 days over Chicago, with 2 Stinson SM-1 Detroiters, one as refueler and the other as receiver. While America led the way with in-flight refueling in the 1920s, Europe and Britain were not far behind. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, UK, began experimenting in 1930 using biplane bombers. Rather than increasing range, the aim was to lighten takeoff weights by carrying less fuel, thus allowing greater payloads to be carried. In 1934, Flight Lieutenant Richard Atchley, Royal Air Force, aware of the American experiments over the previous decade, invented and patented his looped hose system in which both tanker and receiver trailed cables with grappling hooks on the ends. The tanker would fly across the receiver cable to effect a hook-up, and once engaged, a receiver crewman reeled in the cables and the tanker's 90-meter fuel hose. Once connected, the tanker climbed above to achieve gravity-fed fuel transfer. Once refueling was complete, the crewman disconnected the hose and the tanker reeled it in, then turned away to break a weak link in the cable connection. Sir Alan Cobham, the British pioneer of long-distance survey flights in the 1920s, further developed Atchley's looped hose system. The Cobham system employed a mechanism to fire a projectile to lay the receiver line across the tanker's trailing cable, and once the hooks engaged, a receiver crewman would reel in the line and refueling hose and initiate fuel transfer. An alternative method, in which a metal hook was fired from a gun to engage the receiving aircraft, was, understandably, abandoned. Cobham and his crew made a non-stop proving flight from England to India in an airspeed single-engine monoplane. The 8,000-kilometer 2-day journey required 4 in-flight refuelings. The company that Cobham created in 1934, Flight Refueling Limited, led the way worldwide and later became the aerospace company Cobham Limited, which still develops aerospace innovations. In America, greater and greater flight endurance records were made. In 1935, brothers Al and Fred Key kept their Curtiss Robin aloft for more than 27 days using a spill-free valve on the end of the fuel hose from a tanker, greatly improving safety. Food and water were also lowered by rope to the pilots. In 1958-59, refueled flight endurance more than doubled when a Cessna 172 was kept in the air by 2 pilots for just under 65 days using ground-to-air refueling from a moving truck rather than air-to-air. By 1939, Cobham's method had been refined sufficiently to be used on a regular Imperial Airways transatlantic airmail and passenger service. 4 short Empire flying boats were fitted with a looped hose system. A long fuel hose from the tanker looped behind it to engage with a receptacle beneath the receiver tail. Adoption of the air-to-air refueling procedure, together with extra fuel tanks, enabled the Empires to lift off at well below maximum weight. Although no operational in-flight refueling was deemed necessary or practical during the war, Some interesting proposals were made, and experimental flights were conducted by the US Army Air Corps. Ideas included launching bombing raids against Japan from Midway Island using B-17 bombers and B-24 converted tankers, B-24 bombers using US Navy seaplane tankers, and even B-17s towing their own tankers in the form of fuel-laden gliders. A variation of the looped hose method was successfully tested in 1943 at Eglin Field, Florida. When the very long-range B-29 Superfortress first bombed Japan from Chinese bases, proposals were made for in-flight refueling from B-24 tankers. However, once the B-29 began operating from captured islands closer to Japan, its 26,000-litre fuel capacity proved adequate. Then there was the question of fighters with the range to escort bombers to distant targets. One experiment involved a B-24 tanker dangling an external fuel tank on a cable for attachment, in flight, to a P-38 fighter. However, with the difficulties encountered and the advent of the P-82 twin Mustang long-range escort fighter, such experiments were abandoned. Indeed, after the war, a P-82 using external fuel tanks set an unrefueled fighter distance record of over 8,000 kilometers from Hawaii to New York. Meanwhile, a game-changing FRL innovation, the hose and drogue system, was trialed. A trailing fuel hose fitted with a funnel-shaped drogue, perforated to reduce drag, could be engaged by a forward-facing probe on the receiving aircraft. The US Cold War posture required Strategic Air Command B-47 Stratojet bombers to strike targets anywhere in the Soviet Union. US manufacturing rights were obtained for the FRL looped hose refueling system, and B-29 Superfortresses were converted to KB-29 tankers. A trial was staged in 1949, the first non-stop round-the-world flight, accomplished by a Texas-based B-50 Superfortress, a refined B-29, refueled by KB-29s deployed along the route. The 94-hour flight covered nearly 38,000 kilometers. That flight proved system viability for routine air-to-air refueling, although the grapple line and looped hose technique was already being replaced by hose and drogue. Strategic Air Command air refueling wings were formed and combat tested in 1950-53 during the Korean War. KB-29 tankers refueled F-84 fighter bombers, a probe in the F-84's wingtip fuel tank engaging with the tanker's drogue. In 1949, the RAF used a Lancaster tanker to refuel a Meteor fighter 10 times in one flight, using the probe and drogue system. In America, ideas for giving fighters greater range without in-flight refueling were trialed. Fighter Conveyor, or FICON, involved a B-36 bomber carrying its own F-84 escort fighter beneath it on a trapeze. A prototype Parasite jet fighter small enough to fit into the B-36 bomb bay was also produced. In another trial, a pair of F-84s were attached to a bomber's wingtips, known as Project Tiptoe. However, the inherent danger in docking aircraft in flight forced those projects to be abandoned. By 1950, in-flight refueling had improved to the point that fighters routinely flew across the Atlantic. As the drogue system only allowed a fuel transfer rate of 400 liters per minute, Boeing developed a rigid tail-mounted flying boom for the KB-29, allowing a larger diameter fuel pipe for faster fuel transfer. It required a boom operator, lying in the tail turret, to visually fly the telescoping boom to the receiving aircraft's receptacle. Flying the boom accurately was accomplished with ruddervator control surfaces. Boeing incorporated the boom in the KC-97, a tanker version of the C-97 Stratofreighter, the world's first factory-built, rather than converted in-flight tanker. Today, both rigid boom and hose and drogue systems have been adopted by air forces around the world. With the introduction of the 8-jet engine B-52 Stratofortress bomber in 1955, the slower and lower flying piston engine KC-97 tanker became obsolete. Its replacements included the KC-130 tanker version of the Hercules transport, still in use after 60 years, now as the J-model variant, and the Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker, developed alongside the B-707, with more than 800 in US service since 1957. The latter is only now being replaced by the Boeing KC-46 Pegasus, adapted from the B-767 airliner. In 1957, the round-the-world non-stop record time, set in 1949 by a piston-engine B-50, was more than halved by a trio of B-52s and KC-97 tankers. After Korea, the Vietnam War was the next conflict to feature regular in-flight refueling. Since then, it has been used to facilitate bombing raids of unprecedented range. In the 7 Black Buck operations during the 1982 Falklands War, a trio of RAF Vulcan bombers attacked the Argentine-held airfield at Port Stanley, a 12,000-kilometer round trip from their base on Ascension Island. The operations required no less than 11 Victor tankers, providing hose and drogue refueling. In 1991, Operation Desert Storm began with an even longer mission. 7 US-based B-52G Stratofortresses made a cruise missile strike against power stations and communications centers in Iraq. The 22,500-kilometer round trip lasting 35 hours, and each requiring 6 or more air-to-air refuelings by KC-10 and KC-135 tankers. In 1999, when the B-2 Spirit bomber made its combat debut in the Kosovo War, even its 11,000-kilometer range required extension by in-flight refueling. US-based B-2s also flew missions against Afghanistan from 2001, Iraq from 2003, and Libya in 2011 and 2017, the latter requiring 4 refuelings for each flight. The SR-71 spy plane, with a supersonic duration of only 90 minutes, required in-flight refueling for all its missions. Its JP-7 fuel necessitated a special version of the KC-135 tanker, the Q model. The SR-71 had a fuel capacity of 46,000 litres, which leaked until Mach 3 flight had heated the airframe sufficiently to expand its skin panels to close the gaps. The USSR and its allies initially used converted bombers for in-flight refueling. Then, in the late 1980s, the Ilyushin IL-78, a development of the IL-76 strategic transport, was introduced. It was capable of transferring up to 2,200 litres of fuel per minute. China currently flies a homegrown tanker transport designated YY-20, a C-17 lookalike that uses 3 hose and drogue pods. In 1958, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation considered in-flight refueling for the Sabre fighter. After exploring possible tanker options such as the Canberra bomber or even a Buddy Sabre, the idea was discarded. In 1970, with the impending delivery of F-111Cs, that incorporated an in-flight refueling receptacle, RAAF tanker options were again examined with the aim of increasing the tactical flexibility, payload, and endurance of the F-111. The aircraft in mind was the Boeing 707 tanker transport. As events transpired, the transports were not acquired until Qantas provided 4 B707-338Cs during 1979-83, and not converted to tankers until 1991-92, when they were delivered to 33 Squadron. Until then, in-flight refueling of RAAF F-111s and FA-18s was by USAF KC-135 tanker. Once modified, the RAAF B707 tanker could refuel 2 FA-18s simultaneously and up to 6 per mission. RAAF tankers also refueled fighters of foreign air forces. With changes in RAAF structure during 1997-98, Number 486 Squadron's B707 maintenance flight was reassigned to 33 Squadron, and the squadron joined Number 84 Wing of Airlift Group. For 3 months in 1998, the squadron deployed a pair of B707s to Kuwait, supporting Operation Southern Watch, enforcing a UN-sanctioned post-Gulf War no-fly zone over southern Iraq. The B707's next deployment was to the war in Afghanistan in 2002, supporting Operation Slipper to oust the Taliban regime. Number 84 Wing maintained a detachment of 2 aircraft at Manas in Kyrgyzstan. The contribution of hose and drogue refueling capability was invaluable, as some 350 coalition fighter aircraft, US Navy and Marine Corps FA-18s, French Mirage 2000s and others, were incompatible with the USAF fleet of boom-equipped tankers. The 84 Wing detachment was awarded a meritorious unit citation for outstanding service. During Operation Iraqi Freedom from 2003, RAAF FA-18s used in-flight refueling in a war theatre for the first time. Their initial missions were escorting coalition airborne early warning and control and tanker aircraft, while later in the campaign, RAAF Hornets were assigned ground attack missions. By 2008, the aging B707s were withdrawn from service and sold to the American company Omega Air. The boom versus drogue deficiency was resolved with the B707's replacement, the KC-30A multi-role tanker transport, or MRTT, which features a fuselage center-line flying boom and underwing pods containing a hose and reel mechanism for probe and drogue refueling. The fly-by-wire boom telescopes out 17 meters and is flown by the onboard air refueling operator, monitoring the operation remotely on-screen to engage with the receiving aircraft's universal aerial refueling receptacle slipway installation. Chosen in 2004 under Project AIR 5402, the MRTT is a conversion of the Airbus A330-220 airliner and, like the B707, doubles as a transport for passengers and freight. The RAAF was the first customer for the type, which was converted by the Military Transport Division of European Aeronautic Defence and Space Company and Qantas Defence Services, Brisbane. 7 KC-30As, including 2 converted ex-Qantas airliners, were acquired during 2011-2019. The role was assigned to Air Mobility Group, and the aircraft are operated by 33 Squadron at RAAF Base Amberley. The MRTT can itself be refueled from another boom-equipped tanker. The MRTT's first operational deployment was to the war in Iraq and Syria during 2014-2020. The aircraft delivered fuel to a range of coalition aircraft and RAAF, E-7A Wedgetails, FA-18A Hornets, and FA-18F Super Hornets in some 1,440 missions. The MRTT can refuel most RAAF aircraft. Operations supported have ranged from the Middle East to the Pacific and Antarctica. Since Australia's acquisition of the aircraft, more than half a dozen nations have opted to purchase the MRTT. Like many other roles, in-flight refueling is set to be accomplished by both manned and unmanned aircraft. In 2021, a Boeing MQ-25 Stingray drone successfully refueled FA-18E and F-35 fighters for the US Navy's Carrier-Based Aerial Refueling System program.